Hello, and welcome to another enlightening episode of Inspiring Psychologists, Breaking the Mold of Private Practice. I'm your host, Wendy Kendall, psychologist and private practice coach. Today, we're tackling a topic that I know raises a lot of questions for psychologists and therapists in private practice: transitioning between therapy and coaching, building a successful practice. Whether you're a seasoned professional looking to diversify your services, or you're new to private practice and exploring different avenues, this episode promises to be a trove of valuable insights. We'll be discussing the similarities, differences, and interplay between therapy and coaching, and how to navigate these domains in a way that builds a successful and rewarding practice. To delve deep into this subject, I'm thrilled to welcome two guests who've navigated this transition and have built thriving practices that incorporate and combine both therapy and coaching. Our first guest is Michaela Thomas, a clinical psychologist, author, and director of The Thomas Connection. Michaela integrates therapy and coaching in her work with senior women leaders, helping them to burn bright without burning out. Joining her is Paula Gardner, a business psychologist and human givens therapist. Paula blends therapy and coaching in her practice with a special focus on supporting the mental health and performance of entrepreneurs. Both Michaela and Paula generously share their unique experiences, discuss the challenges they faced in bringing both of these elements into their practice, and provide practical strategies that have been successful for them. Now, without further ado, let's dive into the world of transitioning between therapy and coaching and how we can leverage both in service of a thriving private practice. And don't forget, if you're interested in exchanging ideas on how to grow your private practice, join us in the Inspiring Psychology Practices Facebook group. Connect with us on LinkedIn or visit our website at inspiringpsych.com. That's inspiringpsych.com. Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Inspiring Psychologist, Breaking the Mold of Private Practice podcast. And in this episode, we're going to be discussing the transition between therapy and coaching and the experiences of two successful practitioners who've navigated along the lines of those different areas of our practice. And so I'm really looking forward to hosting this conversation today. I'm also going to take part in it as somebody who's had some experience navigating this way of operating private practice as well. So I know that the people that we're speaking to today, Paula Gardner from the Good Therapy Practice, and also Michaela Thomas from the Thomas Connection, have navigated this transition between coaching and therapy in different ways. Their paths have been different. And also my own path of integrating what I learned in when I trained in internal family systems therapy into my coaching practice is a different way of operating again. So I really hope that you enjoy this discussion. And I'd really, if there's one topic that I think will generate a lot of discussion in our profession, it's something like this. It's this one around, what are the differences? What does it look like to move from therapy to coaching and back again? How do we integrate those into our practice? So I'd really love to see your comments in the comment section as well, and to get into it with you there too. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome both Paula Gardner and Michaela Thomas to the podcast. Hello, both of you. Hi.
Hi.
Hi there. Hi, Michaela. Hi, Paula. Lovely to see you. Okay, so I gave a little bit of a spiel to start with there, and I can hear a little bit of noise on the background, so I don't know if any of you can hear that too. No?
No, not my end.
Okay, let's carry on. So I gave a little bit of a spiel there about this topic of transitioning between coaching and therapy. And both of you have experienced that. So could I ask you to just give a little bit of an introduction to yourselves to start with? So maybe start with Michaela and then over to Paula, please.
So I'm Michaela Thomas. I'm a qualified clinical psychologist and coach and therapist and author and speaker and very much multi-hyphenated. I am the founder of the private practice, The Thomas Connection, and I am an author of the book, The Lasting Connection. And I focus on both therapy for individuals and couples and coaching. So I specialize in group coaching for highly ambitious women on the brink of burnout. And so I love this discussion of thinking about what's therapy, what's coaching, because I also do corporate speaking and thinking about coaching in that space as well. So I'm really grateful to be invited today.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, Paula, over to you.
Hi, Wendy. So, yeah, you're totally right. I've made the transition and actually, balance the two. But my previous background was actually business, so PR and marketing, and I ran my own PR and marketing company, which is how we
Yes, many
connected.
years ago, like 10 years ago or something.
And then I sort of moved into coaching business owners through doing their own PR and marketing, so bringing more coaching in. And what I was finding was that there are a percentage of business owners who were taking on my, suggestions and doing great, but they were significant that weren't or just weren't doing anything. So as time went on, that really piqued my interest in learning more about coaching. So I did qualified as a coach. And then, of course, once you start down this track, you just so again, that piqued my interest even more.
Psychology got hold of you.
Yeah. So I ended up qualifying as a business psychologist and then qualifying as a counsellor and psychotherapist. So I bring elements of all, even, the old business stuff creeps in there. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, Michaela, just coming back to you, can you describe a little bit also your journey in terms of therapy, coaching, the development of your private practice, and so on?
Yeah, sure. I guess what has been a really sort of important mantra to me in the work that I do has been about how I create more impact for others with less impact on myself. And that balancing of the compassion I give to others as a practitioner, whilst also letting self-compassion come in. And that's been really important because of the experiences I have had of working as a therapist and psychologist in the NHS in very busy inner London kind of practices where the targets were sky high, and I experienced an episode of burnout. So there it was really important for me to think about what were the ingredients for that, what were the makings of that experience of burnout, and how I then developed private practice, sort of small scale to begin with, and grew and grew and grew until it was what I do fully. And that's what, my brand has been going for about 8 years now. So it was really important to practice what I preach, and that's how I teach others as well. And this is where I navigate the difference between therapy and coaching, because some people may not need an intervention, they may not need healing and support and coming out of a clinical state, like mental health problems like depression or anxiety or stress and burnout. They may want to put systems in place for prevention to make sure that they don't go down that place, to develop a compassionate mind, that they are kinder to themselves and more able to be successful, be ambitious, be high striving without the risk of the burnout as a result. So that's why it was really important for me personally, because I've been in that experience. and letting go of doing things perfectly, letting go of pleasing everyone, and starting to please myself a bit more and bringing myself into the mix was really important then in moving away from a NHS service and then fully working for myself, because I can dictate how I work each day and how my work week looks and what my targets are, what I do month to month. So I sort of try to talk the talk and walk the walk, if you may. And I think that's why it's been inspirational to work with me in kind of smaller, intimate group containers of coaching, because people then get to ask, how do you do this? How do you juggle motherhood with a successful practice? How do you manage to write a book when you've got a young child? And it's the clue is in exactly that. I live a life that is not at the brink of burnout, because it wouldn't be sustainable. So success for me is then figuring out what clients do I offer therapy to, because they need that healing. Maybe there's been traumatic experiences, maybe there is an ongoing active episode of depression that needs treatment, versus who can have coaching to kind of build a life that is more sustainable so they don't actually get to the point of developing mental health problems. All of that has been kind of cloaked in my own experience.
Yeah, sure. And so for both of you, and just to understand how you kind of structure your practices, I guess. Michaela, I think in your introduction, you mentioned that you offer therapy for both individual and couples. And I remember you and I have had in-depth discussions about that over the years. And then offering coaching, small group coaching, to high striving women on the verge of burnout. And I've seen a lot of the kind of material that you've produced around that as well, because you talk a lot about that on social media too. And so, and with Paula, you were saying about being a business psychologist, but also then training and qualifying in psychotherapy. So for each of you, do those areas of your practice tend to blend, or do you try to keep them quite separate? So I'll come over to you, Paula.
Okay. I think there's two levels here. One is the sort of marketing and outside world level, and the other is what's happening in the room. So from a marketing point of view, I do keep them separate. So for coaching, I tend to work with business owners, usually around visibility, given my PR and marketing background. And of course, there's a lot of psychological stuff around visibility, people being nervous about stepping up, people having bad experiences, people just, having to find time and looking at, schedules and their approach to work and so on. And then the good therapy practice is generally, therapeutic. It's about helping business owners cope and deal with, either distressing business situations or life situations that every business owner will go through. But of course, there's an element of coaching that creeps into that as well. And business owners in particular, I think, respond really well to coaching, because that's what we hear a lot of the time on social media, on workshops and so on. It's often a very coachy mindset that you can connect with and then do the deeper work underneath that.
Exactly. Yeah. I love to hear that integration. And I think your point around the difference in how that is marketed is a really interesting. I've got this whole thing about how marketing is actually part of the initial conversation with our clients. And so, when we're reaching people at different stages in a change process and coming along different paths, and it makes sense that we would be having different conversations according to different areas of our practice. So Michaela, thanks for sharing that, Paul. It was really interesting. Michaela, coming over to you, how do you hold and manage and contain these different areas of practice?
Well, you can think of it very kind of as completely separate things, almost like I would move someone from a therapy contract to a coaching contract, for instance, because there are different agreements between me as a practitioner and them as the client obtaining the service. So that's something that's been successful sometimes when someone has approached me and wanted to be part of Burn Bright and my group coaching, and I just didn't feel that they were quite in a stable enough place yet. And it might be that they'd have had an episode of some therapy sessions, looking at sort of managing symptoms and feeling more sort of stable in themselves, to be able to go into kind of a deeper transformation, be able to be safe enough to be in a group with others. And when I say safe, I mean so that it wouldn't wobble them, feel safe as in not be unsafe towards others, but to feel safe and stable enough to think about a lot of these things. Sometimes if people come to me and they're actually in an episode of burnout, it may be that they need to be stabilized first, and then we can then use coaching as a way to kind of understand what made you trip up in the first place and what systems and practices do you need to put in place to prevent another episode of that. So there's different points in the journey where I then think, therapy versus coaching. So that said, that's when they can be very separately. And this is also based on me doing a fuller assessment on anyone who comes my way to think about what's going on for them. So part of that is guided by clinical severity. Part of this is also guided by being a little bit more, thinking outside the box. There are two practices I've come across, which one is therapeutic coaching, which I think is a really fascinating term.
Say that again, therapeutic
coaching.
Coaching, right. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So, I've heard of that too.
I'm kind of playing around with that. So I'm playing around with that because I've heard, and might be that I am sort of at odds with other practitioners, which is fine. It's fine to not always agree and be in an echo chamber. But I personally think that coaching can be very transformational and deep as well, even though I don't go into certain background experiences and not intending to trigger. But therapeutic coaching, I think, is a really good term for when someone who's qualified to hold that space can provide that, whereas someone who may just, and I don't mean just in a derogatory way, but to be a life coach means that there are certain things you are not able to do. And for me as a qualified psychologist, I can hold the space in a therapeutic way as well. So therapeutic coaching is one term I've come across that I've been kind of thinking about expanding my practice into as well. Second one is business therapy, which is obviously similar to Paula, thinking about working with business owners. Often we are already more interested in self-development, things that can grow our practices, things that can help our business grow. But it's not necessarily that you need any personal therapy, but you might need to have some therapy around, say, maybe you're procrastinating big projects, or maybe you are second-guessing and I'm getting a bit caught up in imposter syndrome. And it may not be that you properly need therapy. So this is not my term, but I came across a psychologist called Joe Carlisle who does business therapy. And it's, again, so therapeutic coaching and business therapy, it's almost like they're two different blends. And I think we're ready to have these discussions of how we consider these integrations ethically and with integrity, and considering what works for whom and who is equipped to provide these practices.
I think those are great questions and great points. And at this point, I just want to also share some of my own experiences on this path. So obviously, I've been an occupational psychologist now for 27 years, and I still can't believe I'm saying that. I was chartered in 2000, so I've been 23 years chartered. And then in 2018, I ended up starting this path to become qualified in internal family systems therapy. And that was partly because of personal interest and partly because I was really interested in the application of that model to my coaching practice. So I've had a corporate practice, and I have offered executive coaching for, corporate practice has been 20 years and executive coaching probably the last 13 years or so. And there's definitely situations where I know that, there might be topics prior to doing my AFS training, there may have been topics that came up in coaching where a single question you could really feel the shutdown from someone. So it was really touching a specific sore spot. And as an executive coach holding that space, it felt to me as though there was not really a lot of places to go with it at that point. It was definitely not a point where I was just going to dig. And it was definitely, somewhere where it wasn't easy for someone to explore that topic. And so internal family systems, there isn't an option for training in depth in the model and not doing the therapeutic element of it. So, I did all 3 levels. I've done lots of other coaching and supervision around it, and started to integrate some of that model into my executive coaching practice. And I called it Working with Your Inner Leadership Team. And just as a framework that provides an opening for, well, it's a different kind of container, as you mentioned, Michaela. And IFS is also non-pathologizing. So we talk about the different parts of people having burdens or holding burdens, such as difficult experiences or emotions around things. And so that way of talking about the experiences people have had has been just a more flexible and open way to having conversations that go beyond the purely behavioral, for example, and can hold space for some elements that can be otherwise quite difficult. Now, I don't offer a therapy practice, and I don't know if I would call it business therapy or therapeutic coaching, but it's definitely a format of coaching whereby we can work with a wider array of experiences that people have had that have led to them developing blocks in how they're able to show up. So that's my experience of it, which sounds like, well, coming back to it, I really agree with what you said, Michaela, about we need to have conversations around the integration that happens with therapy and coaching and what that looks like and how to practice safely, ethically, with integrity, and so on. So coming over to you, Paula, because I just want to open up that whole discussion. This whole thing seems to be one of the areas where there have been so many kind of polarized discussion points. Is it coaching? Is it therapy? Should they be 2 different things? Is it wrong to integrate them? What does that look like? So I'm coming over to you, Paula, for some reactions and comments on that.
Okay. So the actual therapy that I have trained in is called the Human Givens. Yeah. And I suppose you could say that it was not a coaching type of therapy, but it is more akin to coaching than sort of deep psychoanalysis. In very much it is, about looking forward. In first therapy session, the client sets their own goal, whether that be it's not about I want to feel better. So I want to feel better to be able to do this. So there's something tangible to work for, that we've got evidence that they are achieving their goal. And I was particularly drawn to the Human Givens because of this. I myself am quite, goal focused, solution focused. The business world, that fits very well with the business world. So probably that thing has shaped the type of therapy that I've chosen to do. And it's not to say we don't, look back at the past, and we do if it's appropriate and it's necessary, but it's not about sort of raking things up from the past for the sake of it.
Right. No, exactly.
Yeah.
But then I don't know if you could maybe share any of the background of Human Givens, because it sounds to me like there's, and I know, Michaela, for example, you use CFT, I think, compassion focused therapy. We know about solution focused therapy. So it sounds to me as though, anyway, there are some of these approaches to psychotherapeutic or psychological relationships, I don't know how to describe that nevertheless could be integrated in either a therapeutic context or in a coaching context.
Yeah. So the Human Givens therapy, a lot of it is about our needs, both as a business owner, as just a human being. So we have fundamental needs, things like sense of security, sense of control, sense of connection, community, privacy, status, achievement, and looking at your life, what is fulfilling those needs, and are they getting fulfilled in balance? So different people will need different amounts, And if you have too little or too much, so for instance, work, for instance, too much work, workaholism, not enough work-life balance. And the way they look at it, obviously, in the context of a business and what that means, the trap business owners fall into is they get a lot of needs met through their business. Things like
Interesting.
status, achievement,
Yeah.
connection, community. And then it
Right.
ends up being not a small life, but a very intense and a lot of pressure put on that business. And basically, the human givens is all about, if those needs aren't being met in balance, then, and to the right amount for you, then that's where things can start to go awry. So it's very much looking about your life and where you're getting those needs met right now, and also putting into steps, what you need to do to get those needs met. I think that for me, this is where the coaching bit comes into it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, this just lends itself immediately. And I don't know if, Michaela, you're nodding your head vigorously as well, whether you have any comments, but this just speaks immediately to me as an organizational psychologist, right? I hear echoes of, the good old PERMA V model, and also some of these somehow some threads that link to this whole question of, do we have work-life balance? The whole element of it, the integration of different domains of life, right? So, yeah. Michaela, you were nodding your head vigorously when you were listening to that. I just wanted to open up.
Yeah, I was, because even though we come from different therapeutic modalities, there is often a lot more crossover between modalities than there are differences, because they are trying to capture universal human experiences. So they kind of have to be, right? So I have a lot of crossover between compassion-focused therapy and IFS. And what you were talking about, Wendy, relates to that as well. And CFT is also a non-pathological model that can be used to also treat pathology. So that's how it splits into compassion-focused therapy versus compassionate mind training, because we all have a mind. You can train your mind to be more compassionate. And this is how it sits really well in a non-clinical population. Like, I can coach anyone to develop a more compassionate mind with themselves and with others. There is no side effects or harm from doing that. Obviously, if we then think about stepping into territories where there is blocks, fears, or resistances around being compassionate to yourself or others, that may well have come from experiences of trauma, for instance. And then we can think about treating that with compassion-focused therapy, which is, evidence-based around depression, anxiety, trauma, and all of these difficult experiences as well. But I am trained in CBT first, and CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, as well as acceptance and commitment therapy. And this is why I'm nodding along with Paula, because ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy, it lends itself really well to a corporate organizational setting as well. I am trained in ACT in the workplace, because we can think about these different domains. How do we integrate domains? How do we live a life that is worth living? How do we live a life that matters to us? And that's, again, having your needs met. And often in the human experience, difficult thoughts and feelings show up and pull us away from acting effectively, acting like the human we want to be, making it harder for us to make the choices of acting in line with our values. So this is where I think about where I combine CFT, or compassion-focused therapy, or compassionate mind training, with ACT, because I feel that they both together capture the human experience in a non-pathological, we are the same kind of way. And I think that is the movement that I see today and in psychology practices, that it's no longer about the blank slate, the tabula rasa. It's kind of moving away. People come to me and want to know that I am like you, I suffer too. And that's the whole point of the human
that's
experience.
a really important point.
We all do suffer. We are not blank slates. I am not on a high horse. I am not immune to difficulties, and I haven't figured all of the stuff out. I'm just a few steps ahead of someone.
Exactly.
I like that sort of the guiding you up the mountain kind of idea of having the equipment, having the tools, have trodden this road before. I might tell you where to put your feet, but you still need to do the work of climbing up the mountain. That's how I think of both coaching and therapy in a lot of ways.
So I guess one of the things, when it comes to private practice and kind of integrating both coaching and therapy elements, Michaela, again, earlier you alluded to, and you as well, Paula, have both alluded to the fact that, we're creating containers for people that need to be in integrity, that need to be resourced properly, that we need to have the skills and capabilities to deliver this kind of approach. I mean, I'm going to say it straight out. I feel like when we have these, not on this podcast, of course, but when we have these polarized discussions in the media about, oh, is it this or is it that? And, trying to expand the differences between coaching and therapy. One, I think we're on a hiding to nothing because, as you said, Michaela, we're actually coming back to what is the human experience here. Two, we're kind of going against what we've learned over the years, which is trying to categorize and separate and maximize the differences between people's home life, professional life, working life, etc. just is such a massive workload for people anyway. So a more integrated person seems like it's a more integrated life would be awesome. And I feel like there's a lot more nuance and a lot more gray areas and not straight fixed answers that we need to be able to hold space for safely. So when it comes to that, whether it's, there's different elements that kind of come into it for me. One is, what is a workable contract? So one of my supervisors for a while was a guy called Chris Burris, who is a senior trainer with the IFS Institute. And he had this wonderful thing in our supervision sessions where he would say, is it a workable contract? And this idea that we are contracting with people and that at every session, that's kind of a living contract that we're creating. So the paperwork is one thing, but the establishment of a workable contract with people is also something that we need to open up. And just negotiating with people in your sessions and in your relationship with them about, are we in therapy now? Are we, what is a workable contract in this situation? So how do you go about that? I'm going to come over to you, Michaela.
So how do I go about making sure that the client I'm with is in the right contract, or whether they are happy to stay in that contract or want to move over?
It's all of the above, because I think it's all a living kind of experience, of moving between these areas.
I mean, as you were speaking, Wendy, a thought came to my mind about one of the very common schemas we as psychologists, and maybe more clinical psychologists than business, I don't know, but it's something I learned a long, long time ago, that two of the most common schemas in psychologists are to do with perfectionism and self-sacrifice. Right? So we, by the definition of that, the nature of our profession is that we really do want to categorize and get this right. It's because we are sitting with people. I see
that a lot.
The damage that can be done can be immense. So we need to get this quote unquote right. Inverted commas here for those listening without video. And that's why I think a lot of really good psychologists in this profession are holding themselves back from stepping into a space of coaching because they really fear getting it wrong. And what damage could that do? And this is a very important discussion because it's about ethical practice and safekeeping. That's a big part of my training, has been to always make sure that people are safe. So that said, I think that also means that we almost like throw the baby out with the bathwater and don't explore and experiment, try new practices that could, again, capture the human experience. And there are a lot of people who we know do not access psychological therapy. This is why we've had whole initiatives called, improving access to psychological therapies. And still the uptake is low compared to the amount of people who need it. And it might be easier for people to kind of Google coaching, right? Or say, I'm going to have a bit of coaching on the company. It's very different to say, I'm going to go and see a therapist. There's still so much stigma in that. So that said, how do we help people approach these practices and get more support, right? Whatever that might be with. So how we then differentiate between the contracts, or which contract you should be in. Again, I'm guided by severity. I'm guided by how people are feeling. I'm guided by what I'm hearing. As a psychologist, I'm trained in everything from risk assessments to safeguarding. And that means that I'm listening out intently, constantly, in what people are saying in the group container. And if I hear something that makes me kind of go, you need more support, you need more safekeeping, I would then take that person to the side to make sure that that's not this discussion in front of the group, and see if they need any more support. Do they need to have access to therapy alongside the coaching? Do they need to come out of the coaching space entirely? Do they need to pause their journey? And vice versa, if they're coming from therapy before they go into the coaching. So this is where I think assessing, formulating, looking at the function of which contract they're going to be in. You know, what would the function be for you if you accessed coaching right now? What would the function be if you access therapy? What would you want to unlock? Where are you wanting to go? Because in my experiences, it is absolutely possible for someone who's been through a lot to still access like another layer of that in coaching and be like, that doesn't mean that that part of you isn't invited along for the journey, but it may not be the focus. And as long as someone feels like I'm able to keep that the focus, and that's a separate focus, that maybe a traumatic experience is not what I'm bringing to this container. And it's something that you have to use your clinical sensitivity to sit with. And this is where coming back to the question of what works for whom and who is equipped to provide you what practice. That if you are a life coach who inviting in lots of people with traumatic experiences and you're not trained in, say, group cohesion, group dynamics, safeguarding, that to me could be dangerous. But if you are someone who understands where your limits go and who you're calling into your world and what you offer them, then I think that's a very different discussion.
I think your point about understanding limits is one that really resonates with me as well. I'm going to come back to it. Just making a little note there. I'm going to come across. Thank you for that, Michaela. It brought up a bunch of stuff, and I was writing notes as you were talking there, and we'll come back to them. Paula, what about you? How are you kind of managing when you're working across that intersection between coaching and therapy? And as Michaela said, negotiating and kind of reworking the psychological contract, if not the actual paperwork.
Yeah. I suppose having two separate brands for a start helps, because they are two different containers. And I think within therapy, we're doing therapy, and I may bring my coaching skills to help make that session more effective for my client, but it's therapy.
Right.
The coaching skills are more about when they've set their goal and we're looking at what tasks and homework, working out what that might be during the week to actually help them make progress.
Yeah.
And again, when I am coaching business clients around visibility and confidence, like Michaela, if something just feels a bit amiss and I think they need to do some deeper work, then, that's a separate conversation.
Exactly.
And it might not be with me, it might be that our relationship stays a coaching relationship and they do that deeper work with someone else, rather than me trying to have a dual relationship with them.
Yeah.
But like you say, Michaela, it is about knowing your own boundaries. And also for me, they have a very different flow, both coaching and therapy, and switching from one to another in a session doesn't really happen so much. However, just thinking about risks and something like Michaela said, and you said you've jotted it down. I have been on coaching programs with coaches who are not particularly clinically qualified, who are using tactics like shaming people if they don't, basically stay up with everybody else on the program. I don't know if you guys have seen the BBC documentary on, I won't say the name, but a big coaching organisation that basically uses a lot of, quite nasty tactics to break people down and take their money. And I think, there's one thing thinking about qualified people who are working to, set clinical standards, who are in supervision, who take it very seriously and very responsible. And there's a whole industry out there that doesn't come anywhere close.
Exactly. I've had these kinds of conversations recently, speaking with some of my clients who are obviously psychologists in private practice, and discussing this whole topic of moving from, therapy, coaching, therapy, and so on. And it strikes me the amount of care and the amount of, as you said, Michaela, which goes to even fear of making a mistake. And for me, it was like widening this conversation up a little bit to say, okay, now we can have a conversation about what safe and effective professional development looks like, so that you're working within the as we are all required to do, working within the limits of our competencies, where we have requirements for ongoing CPD, which can be met in a variety of ways. We don't all have to go and get a PhD and a master's every time we want to add something. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm just saying there's a range of opportunities for CPD, where supervision is an ongoing requirement, where insurance is an ongoing requirement, where all of, keeping the data safe is an ongoing requirement, and all of those things. But when we really hold ourselves back and become quite almost rigid in thinking about transitioning across this, what has been treated as almost like a hard boundary, kind of zooming out on that and looking at who else is therefore working with people in those contexts, and is that necessarily always going to be safe? I think we have a role to play in stepping forward into and delivering help where we can do that effectively. So my point is often, look, if you want to go and do the master's, the postgrad certificate, the PhD, or whatever, in either a coaching or a therapeutic modality, that's entirely up to you. But at the end of the day, when we become registered, qualified, chartered, what that means is we have been deemed to be fit for independent practice. And that means we are deemed to be responsible enough so that we know what CPD we require to extend our professional skills and competencies. When we're working with an individual, whether, no matter how many skills and competencies we've got, whether that individual is, whether they need something that is beyond what we can provide them, then what do we do about that? And we also have effective supervision and all the other things, and the workable contract. And that's what I call creating a safe container for whatever shows up there. So, yeah, Michaela, you're nodding. Paula, you're nodding. I welcome any comments on that.
No, I really agree, because it's one of those things that, again, as someone who specializes in perfectionism, I see those patterns showing up so much in this, needing to do it right and dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's. And this is really important. This is why we have governing bodies that protect the general public from malpractice. This is why we have, these different various variations of oaths that we take to make sure that we do no harm. So I think you're right that it's important to acknowledge that there are many ways of furthering your development and learning new skills. That doesn't have to be like collecting masters, like we have a propensity to in our profession, and we all know the slight hoarding issue around burning books. We all do it, because when can you stop learning? I mean, I always think about this at a Buddhist concept of having the mind of the eternal student. I'm always learning. I'm always growing. Every single person I work with teaches me something new that I don't necessarily always find in a book. And I obviously supervise junior colleagues as well. I provide business supervision as well as coaching for other aspiring psychologists. And it's one of the things I try to say to people is just finding your way of practicing, find your flow, find your secret sauce, whilst you still stay within the ethical boundaries and constraints. There are things that are put in place to protect the general public, but we don't always have to follow them the same way as everyone else, if that makes sense. So have you made sure that you've not done harm? Have you made sure that you are having the client's interest in mind, and spotting some of these marketing strategies that are out there, probably having sponsored content to try to find you and target you, and acknowledging that actually, some of those things I will say no to, like FOMO marketing or pain point marketing, fear-based, shame-based marketing, like you touched upon already. And actually understanding that, I'm not going to design my psychology practice and my group coaching the way that necessarily some of these marketing gurus and other coaches tell me to do, because I then know if I go back to my own boundaries and my own ethical practice, that it wouldn't be safe, right? So say, for instance, or making sure that you get people to always renew or continue buying from you when their contract is ended. Like, why would I want to do that, right? I would have to look at function. And like you talked about, Paula, about the needs being met. If the needs have been then met and they've, this has been a workable contract, they've now come to its end, it would be unethical for me to try to convince them or persuade them to buy from me again. No. So this is a big difference, I think, of how we then think about the service we provide, not the selling, the service. I think that's really important.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to kind of bring it back to you and your practices. We're talking there about these kind of, these perfectionism drivers and the whole getting it right thing. And I think, as with so many, we're all human. And so stereotypes, pigeonholes, different barriers, mental barriers we put in our way can all be part of this process of developing our practices. And so I'm just wondering whether you, either of you, had to kind of work with yourselves when it came to these ideas around expanding what your psychology practice looked like. I'm going to come across to Paula first. So what was your experience of breaking out of the mold?
Good question. So I've got another one that sits alongside perfectionism, and that's impatience.
That's good.
Yeah, I want to do everything properly, but I also want it done now. Yeah. So that's been a real impact, because when you're working with clients, you have to work at their own pace. So previously when I was coaching, I could perhaps had a little bit more control over the pace, if you know what I mean, because as a coach, you're like, it is a
bit more in drive.
Yeah. But as within working with therapy client, it is very client driven. And yes, you can get them back on track because it's so easy for distractions to come in. You can and get back to the work that they came in wanting to do. But I know for me, it has been, my challenge, because I can sort of see where they will eventually get, but, they may
They've got to get there.
And all the different stop-off points are all very important.
Yeah.
So it's been really, really good and interesting learning journey for me, that it's not just about getting from there to there. It's about taking them on a rich experience.
Right.
So that has been one of the biggest learnings, but also one of the challenges that I've gone through. Yeah. Was that your question? I can't quite remember what the question was.
I always ask really long questions, so I can understand why that might be. But I think I'm also thinking about how do we kind of get over ourselves a little bit. So I do think you were answering the question there, which is, your own impatience, the things that come up on our own path as well, that we have to work with ourselves, do our own work on in order to ourselves do our own meandering and find the right path for us, right? That richness shows up on our path as well. For you, Michaela, thinking about also your background and coming out of NHS and so on, and having, the label of clinical psychologist, which is, I think in itself is a very strong brand, right? In that respect. Have there been any experiences for you about breaking out of the mold, about having to kind of get beyond your own, yourself, your own barriers?
Oh, so many times. I've gone around halfway across the world to compassion retreats, and I find a lot of my learning and into myself comes from my yoga practice that I have as a non-negotiable on my CEO day on Fridays. I go to 2 hours of yoga, and it's been just attending lots of different spaces where I've earmarked time to reflect. Maybe on the yoga mat, maybe at a day retreat, maybe at sitting down to do a vision boarding, whatever it might be. The practices that other people facilitate for me, even though I know all the stuff because I teach it to others. Sometimes you need to have someone who holds up the mirror for you and helps you think and reflect on it. And for me, 2023, sort of being the first full year of coming back from my second maternity leave, has been a really stretchy year because I want to do lots of different things. Much like Paul, I have some impatience issues that I'm addressing and noticing and sitting with. But the theme for me this year is thinking about how do I work with embodied leadership? How do I show people how the lifestyle I'm trying to teach people, the way of integrating your different domains, the way of living a valuable life, doing that as a beacon, right? So actually standing tall in myself and having kind of a compassionate stance towards myself and others. I think of that as a kind of almost like as a beacon, as someone who radiates that energy to others. So that was my word for the year. And my business manager sent me this card, which I'm going to show you. And she just sort of sent me a lighthouse.
Oh, yeah.
So that sort of sits in my desk.
Cool.
And actually, that's a reminder for whenever I get hooked by these thoughts and feelings, these things that show up as part of our human experience of, you can't do this. What will the profession think? Is a classic one. What will the other psychologists? What would they think?
What are they going to say about this podcast, Michaela?
Yeah. What would they say about this? I've been sort of descending down on that for a long time and just noticing them as thoughts and feelings, because all the people who come to me and say, "Oh, I love the work you do. Tell me how I could have a practice like yours." I'm like, "Well, you need to do the work. You need to do the inner work," and that's been everything from money mindsets to how do I get myself out there with visibility, like Paula teaches? How do you do your own PR? How do you work with content strategies? There's a lot of stuff as a business owner I never thought I needed to know when I first trained as a psychologist. So being an entrepreneur is a wild ride. It's a very different stance to when you are employed as a clinical psychologist, where you're paid and you get your monthly salary regardless of what you do, or not regardless, because you obviously ultimately need to hit your targets, but it's very different. So for me, that kind of breaking that mold and thinking about how I want to design my practice, the things I want to do, the things I want to achieve, is all about ultimately the impact I have on other people. How can I reach more people? How can I help disseminate psychology? How can I help other people not fall into the burnout territory, etc., or letting go of that perfectionism that is stopping so many women who are absolutely inspirational to me, who are holding themselves back. And all it takes sometimes is a few small tweaks of looking at that inner voice that they have that's stopping them from putting something out into the world, tolerating making some B- work instead of A+ occasionally, and putting that out into the world. So I have to use this constantly for myself, because you can't be a beacon embodying that leadership to other people if you don't take some of your own medicine, at least some of the time. So that's been my biggest challenge of how I break this mold, because the same thoughts and feelings show up for me. The not enoughness, the fear of failure, the fear of success, which is an even bigger one for a lot of people. All of that would show up for me as well. Again, I have a human mind like all the people I help. So turning compassion practices inwards has been really key for me.
Yeah, cool. I think when I think about integrating IFS into my executive coaching practice, some of the kind of, when I think about how valuable that journey has been, just posing the question around how can we do this differently? How can we support people within a coaching context when, at one moment we were working in a surface area. In IFS terms, we call it working with protectors and managers. And all of a sudden, what's called an exiled part shows up, which is usually where something has triggered one of the deepest wounds. And for me, trying to explore and understand that question has really challenged the way that I think about how therapy and coaching work. And there's parts of me that are resenting the labels of therapy and coaching, because I feel like they're too restrictive in terms of how we then, in a very operational way, use the knowledge and the skills and the capability that we have as psychologists and therapists to actually support people in their everyday lives. So when I come back to this idea of breaking out of the mold, it really feels as though there are some things in our profession that are kind of held up as that are never questioned. We never question that coaching is coaching and therapy is therapy, and whether actually either of those terms really adequately provide a container for what we need to do to support people. And so, yeah, that's what, for me, that's part of the rationale for having these kinds of conversations, and to really just, showcase what it that or just to expose the fact that so many of us are having also these conversations around how do we do this differently, because the way that it's being done does not meet the needs of the world that's out there. It doesn't represent the complexity of the world that's out there. Okay, last question. And thank you so much for staying with me on this rich conversation. Last question is about hopes for the future. So what are your hopes for the future, Paula, when it comes to this transition between therapy and coaching?
Thanks, Wendy. Just more of it. I mean, I'm still on the path. There's not a finite point to it, is there? And the more I go down it, the more I learn, and the more I learn, the more I want to learn more. So yeah, it's that learning and, basically applying it, trying it out, seeing what works with clients. Some things work really well. Some things I've thought, that's amazing. I'm going to try that out with people and let them experience, and it hasn't produced what I thought it would. All that has been fascinating. And I get a lot. I get a lot of needs met from my work. I find it incredibly satisfying, and the connection is really important to me. So yeah, just more of it. I'm very happy with what I'm doing. So yeah, just more of it.
I love it. I can't wait to see more of what you get up to as well. Michaela, over to you. What are your hopes for the future when it comes to thinking about therapy and coaching?
I guess my hope would be that we can have these conversations in a non-judgmental, safe for us space as well, because my experience of going into these spaces and talking about what is coaching, what is therapy, how do we meet the needs, is that unfortunately our profession can be quite critical. This is what happens when we are fear-based, is that we are then getting into our threat systems and start to attack each other. And I think that anyone who dares to break the mold and is a pioneer or, path breaker or pathfinder, whatever you might call it gets a lot of stick then. So I think if we want to think about how do we constantly review and improve and not perfect, but make our services better and our practices safe for people, we need to have these conversations without anyone who raises their hand and go, actually, can I ask this? Without them being attacked. So I think one of my hopes for the future is that we can talk about these things in a safe way, right? Because in our profession, it doesn't always feel that safe. And I know a lot of people who've left online forums or left supervision settings because it hasn't felt safe, and they've felt attacked if we're coming out of the echo chamber. So I think that's really, really important to hold in mind that my wish for everyone is to think about how do I want to have a private practice that suits me, suits the clients who I attract, and also adheres to ethical boundaries. That would be my hope, that people dare to play a little bit more. This is part of my brand, is the pause, purpose, and play practices. So to dare to play and be creative, inspired, and because that's infectious to our clients. They like to see us breaking the mold.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So, Michaela, while we're there with you, where can we find you online, please?
So you can find me on thomasconnection.co.uk, which is my private practice. And you can also find me under the Thomas Connection on social media. So Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn as well as Michaela Thomas. And you can find me on my podcast, Pause, Purpose, Play with Michaela Thomas, and also my book, The Lasting Connection.
Awesome. So we'll make sure we get all those in our show notes as well. And you, Paula, where can we find you online?
So my therapy practice is at thegoodtherapypractice.co.uk, and the business and visibility coaching is at scarletthinking.com. And yes, like Michaela, I'm out and about on social media. Instagram is my social media of choice, and I'm there as the Good Therapy Practice.
And Paula's also an author, and I have a copy of her book, doyourownpr.com.
Yeah.
It was a .com at one point, but the book is just called Do Your Own PR. Yeah. So I'm going to have to write a book, so I can keep up with you guys, I reckon. All right. Thanks so much for your for sharing your wonderful experiences and your insights and your knowledge this morning. I know that I'm sure it's going to create a lot of conversation in our various groups and everything. So thanks so much again. And see you next time for the next episode of the Inspiring Psychologists Breaking the Mold of Private Practice podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
I'd love to hear what you think about the Inspiring Psychologist podcast. So please take a moment to leave a review and give us a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. It makes a massive difference in helping us to reach new audiences. If, like me, you're feeling inspired and moved by the private practice stories in our podcasts, please spread the word across your own networks. And why not encourage your colleagues and friends to listen to the podcast too? To make sure you don't miss out on future episodes, please be sure to subscribe to the Inspiring Psychologist podcast. You can find out more about all my guests from Series 1 at our website, inspiringpsych.com. That's inspiringpsych.com.